Meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, welcome back. Herzlich willkommen zum zweiten Abend des Schweizerischen Instituts für Auslandforschung in diesem Herbstsemester. Nach Christian Lindner wird heute Abend ein ebenso prominenter Gast zu uns sprechen, der britische Historiker Niall Ferguson. Dear Professor Ferguson, dear Niall, a very warm welcome here at Zurich University. We are very proud and honored to have you here. Please give Niall a huge hand. Just some very, very short remarks from my side. Niall Ferguson is one of the foremost historians of our times, as we know. He has written many books, splendid books, all worth reading and studying. His newest book bears the title Doom, The Politics of Catastrophe. You also could have mentioned the catastrophe of politics, but this is another topic. Recent developments make it even more interesting. Niall Ferguson will discuss this topic tonight with us, a tremendous experience. Siaf and Zurich are the first stop on his book tour. The German translation, published by Deutsche Verlags-Anstalt in Stuttgart, will be available from September 3rd on. But we already have the opportunity to buy a copy or two tonight. In other words, this is a true premiere. Seize the opportunity. After Niall's conference, there is, as always with us, the chance to ask questions from here, with you in the hall, and also from our online guests. This is important. The evening is live streamed all over the world. Please understand that due to a very tight timeline, we cannot forward all your questions to Professor Ferguson. I'm also happy to say that the evening is co-produced with VHS Wissen Live, the digital science program, a joint project of numerous Volkshochschulen throughout Germany. Thanks indeed for this extremely creative joint venture. As we have the control over COVID certificates, hopefully in this hall, you may feel free to leave your masks aside for once. You may relax, but if you feel better with it, is also not a problem. And now it's, as I call it, Ferguson time. What can we learn of doomsday and the politics of catastrophe? Dear Niall, again, we are very happy to have you here. The floor is entirely yours.
Danke. Vielen Dank, meine Damen und Herren. Es ist ein großes Vergnügen, hier zu sein. And from now on, I speak in English. Out of laziness, as my German is very rusty, and it would in fact be eine Katastrophe if I attempted this lecture in German. I want to help you. I want to help you put recent events into some kind of historical perspective, because I believe that has been sorely lacking since the beginning of the pandemic. We have swung from regarding the pandemic as just seasonal influenza to treating it as a disaster comparable with the great influenza of 1918-19. Time and again, I have heard journalists describe the events of our time as unprecedented. Whenever anybody uses that word, they are trying to tell you that they know no history. Let me begin with a question. How big a catastrophe is COVID-19? If you, like me, look regularly at the Johns Hopkins website, where they have assiduously kept track of the case numbers and the death numbers and then the vaccine numbers since this event began, you'll be aware that we are looking at a death toll in the neighborhood of 4.6 million around the world. But that is almost certainly an underestimate. If you look at some of the epidemiological models, they forecast a total death toll by the end of this year in the range of 10 to 12 million. But notice, that calculation is of excess mortality, not just COVID mortality. The Economist has just published revised estimates of excess mortality that range as high as 15 million. This sounds like a vast historical disaster, a true catastrophe. In the United States, where I live, we're looking already at 660,000 deaths. 3,500 Americans were dying every day at the peak of the pandemic. We're still losing around 1,000 people to this disease. And global daily deaths are in excess of 10,000. This is not over. I'm frequently asked to come to post-pandemic conferences. I ask when these will be held. There is a great desire for there to be an end. But the truth is that we as human beings want more ends than history can provide. Many things in history take longer, much longer to happen than you expect. And they don't have clearly defined ends in the way that some wars end, in the way that the American presence in Afghanistan just ended. Do not expect COVID-19 to end that way. But at the same time, remember that last year, even in the United States, where management of the pandemic has been proverbially bad, COVID-19 was not the biggest killer. It came third, after cancer and heart disease. I am significantly more at risk now that I've been vaccinated from cancer and heart disease. How can one make sense of death tolls in the millions? Whether it's 4.5 million or 15 million, we come back to Stalin's old joke. One death is a tragedy, 1 million is a statistic. By the way, that wasn't Stalin. If you want to know who said that, who originally said that, you have to buy my book. I'm not going to tell you. The pandemic has constantly surprised us. It continues to surprise us. I had to plan a European itinerary. Switzerland is just the first stop on my little tour of Europe. And I'm also going to Germany. Then I go to Budapest, to Hungary, and then to Ukraine. Imagine my surprise to find that the case rate was highest of all these countries in Switzerland, though I'm still comparatively less exposed than I was back in the United States. If one looks at these charts, which came from today's Financial Times website, the thing that is most striking, I think, is the extraordinary variation from country to country and from time to time. The steepness of the waves of cases and deaths. We still haven't fully, I think, understood why these spike-like waves are so steep. Why the Delta variant seems capable of producing extraordinary surges of infection and then they stop. This happened in India and it has subsequently happened in many other countries. This is a confusing pandemic. Look at these charts. Remember, at the beginning of the pandemic, epidemiologists told you we have to flatten the curve. I said repeatedly, why are you talking about one curve? All pandemics give you multiple curves. They come in waves. So let us put it in perspective. Only relatively recently did this pandemic enter the global top 20 in terms of the percentages of the world population whose deaths can be attributed to the pandemic. To date, it's killed, if you accept the Johns Hopkins numbers, 0.06% of the world's population. If you take the maximum estimate, it's somewhat short of 0.2%. The Black Death was 3 orders of magnitude worse than that, roughly speaking. It may have killed up to a third of all of humanity as it swept across Eurasia. The 1918-19 Spanish flu was roughly 29 times worse. We forget, but HIV/AIDS was roughly 10 times worse. Only quite recently, only this year, has this pandemic exceeded in its relative impact the Asian flu of 1957-58, an event that has largely been forgotten, that even people who lived through it scarcely remember. It's a surprising fact that COVID-19 will not go down in history as one of the great public health catastrophes. But I believe it will go down in history much more than the 1957-58 Asian flu. There is another Niall Ferguson. He spells his name differently from me. He is an epidemiologist. And it was only last year that I understood why my parents had spelt my first name Niall rather than Neil. Because if it had been Neil, I would have received many more death threats from people who blamed the Niall Ferguson at Imperial College London for the lockdowns. I'm an historian, not an epidemiologist. I have no model to offer you. I merely offer patterns from the past. As an historian, I found it easy to see, as early as January of last year, that a great global pandemic was beginning. I remember having that insight even before I arrived at the World Economic Forum at Davos in mid-January of 2020. Pattern recognition is what history gives you. When you see a paragraph that says, strange pneumonia in Wuhan, even if it's on page 5, in the middle or even bottom of the fold, you know that spells trouble. Many of history's pandemics begin with paragraphs like that. And I also knew that waves would be the story of this pandemic, that it would come as the great influenza pandemics of the last century came in these waves. The second wave of the 1918-19 influenza was bigger than the first. So this was a kind of pattern recognition that I think the historian had to offer, even if only the epidemiologists got the airtime and the attention of policymakers. Because the Brits have been counting bodies for longer than anybody, we have really good long time series on mortality in the UK. If you look at mortality over the long run, going back all the way to the mid-19th century, and you just look at deviations from a 10-year average to see the bad years, the years when death really spiked relative to trend. It's striking that in the last 100 years or so, there have been 3 other years as bad as 2020. 1918, 1940, and 1951. Well, you know what happened in 1918, I've already told you. And you know what happened in 1940, we had a little disagreement with the Germans, and it didn't go very well at first. But what happened in 1951? Worst winter for illness, the Daily Mail reported. Doctors emphasize that this is the worst winter for illness ever known. Journalists have been exaggerating for a long time. The Daily Mail has been engaged in hyperbole almost since its foundation. Why was 1951 the worst winter ever? Or at least, why did it seem that way? They had a very bad influenza winter, especially in and around Liverpool. The impact on mortality was comparable with the impact of COVID in Britain last year. Nobody remembers 1951. Nobody. I had no idea until I found this story of the scale of the excess mortality that year. We've lived through a worse pandemic than COVID. HIV/AIDS has killed, as I mentioned, 36 million people. It is an order of magnitude more deadly than COVID has been so far because we found no vaccine. Just last week, the latest attempt to find an HIV vaccine failed. Imagine a counterfactual world in which the vaccines for COVID failed as the vaccines for HIV have failed. Imagine how different the outlook would be. One reason we forget the scale of HIV/AIDS is that such a large proportion of the deaths occurred late in the pandemic in sub-Saharan Africa, after we thought we'd fixed the problem. These distortions of our memories seem to me an extremely important thing for the historian to correct. Imagine if we continue on our present path of vaccinating the wealthy countries and really not vaccinating Africa. Might the history of AIDS repeat itself with COVID, with a huge death toll stretching over years and even decades in Africa that the rest of us pay no attention to? I don't know, but it's possible. Why is this medium-sized disaster? Why is this medium-sized disaster historically significant? Not because of the mortality, not because of the death toll, but I believe because of the economic, social, and political consequences of the disaster. The scale of the economic shock is vastly out of proportion to the scale of the public health disaster. The influenza pandemics of the 20th century had almost no economic consequences that can be discerned in economic data. Life went on. Mortality surged, especially in vulnerable groups, but life went on. By contrast, as Larry Summers and David Cutler estimated last year, the cost to the US alone of this pandemic is likely in the region of 90% of GDP, a far larger number than the 3.5% contraction that was measured by the economists last year. Their estimate is, and I quote, twice the total monetary outlay for all the wars the US has fought since September the 11th, 2001, and approximately the estimate of the damages from 50 years of climate change. The central puzzle of COVID is that its economic impact has been so much greater than the excess mortality would have led you to predict if all you knew was history. This is the puzzle I want to try and resolve for you tonight. If all you knew were the fiscal and monetary consequences of the pandemic, if that was all you knew, suppose you only had access to public finance and monetary data. You were observing Earth from a distant planet, and that was all you knew. You would conclude from these data, which show the federal debt in relation to GDP on one side and the size of the Federal Reserve balance sheet on the other, that World War III broke out in 2008 and is still going on. Because only World War II, in all of American history, has had a comparable impact on the level of public debt in relation to economic activity. How can we explain this? Why has a pandemic that killed a proportion of the world's population compared with the Korean War, had economic impacts that compare with the Second World War? The answer is that for the first time in history, we were able to do something that was quite inconceivable in 1918 and quite inconceivable in 1951 and in 1957, namely to lock everybody in their homes and shut them out of their workplaces for a protracted period of time. This could never have been done in 1957. The proportion of people who could work from home in 1957 was tiny. But with the advent of the internet, a new possibility was created. Mass house arrest to prevent contagion. And that was what we did. Inspired above all by the other Niall Ferguson's March report of March of last year, in which he said, unless we impose lockdowns comparable with those in China until vaccines are available, that was what he said, there will be 2 million or more deaths in the United States and 500,000 in the UK. That one paper became the basis for the policy reaction that we call lockdowns. And these data here, which are capturing the index constructed at the Oxford Blavatnik School of Government, show how amazingly stringent the lockdowns were in many countries, particularly at the beginning in March and April of last year. This explains a large part of the disruption that COVID caused, but only a part. If there had been no lockdowns, many people naively imagine that the virus would have been allowed to let rip. In heated debates on both sides of the Atlantic, there were those who argued for lockdowns, and there were those who said that they were a terrible mistake and we should simply seek herd immunity through natural infection. This was a false dichotomy. We know this now. Even in parts of the United States where no restrictions were imposed, or almost none, mobility still profoundly changed. You can see in these charts here, these red lines and blue lines here, mobility data for the United States relative to the pre-pandemic period from Google. And it turns out that all over America, in blue states and red states, in tightly restricted counties and counties with no restrictions, everybody's mobility collapsed. Fear of the unknown, fear of infection, of hospitalization and death, led to a drastic alteration in behavior. My colleague John Cochrane predicted this in a brilliant paper at the beginning of the pandemic. It was proved to be right by a quite left-leaning economist, Austin Goolsbee, who served in the Obama administration. And he showed that there was no difference in mobility changes according to the levels of regulation. People adapted their mobility on the basis of their perceptions of risk. And these varied over time, depending on the news flow, what they heard about hospitalizations, what they learnt about the virus. So there was never a counterfactual of letting it rip. Not even in the United States, not even in Montana, not even in Wyoming. Nor was there a Swedish counterfactual of letting it rip. The Swedes also drastically altered their behavior, even though the regulations were much less strict than in Norway. So there would have been a significant economic shock even without lockdowns. That we need to recognize. Because again, unlike in 1957, flows of information, some of it accurate and some of it wildly inaccurate, were on a massive scale last year, and they continue to play an enormously important part in people's behavior. In 1957, vaccination was not a controversial subject. People wanted vaccines, whether it was for influenza or polio. But in the age of the internet, even the issue of vaccination becomes a party political issue, even in Switzerland. Because our public sphere has altered in another way. Not only is it possible to tell people you must work from home indefinitely, and they can do it, but also, thanks to the internet, a vast torrent of contagions of the mind has been created. An even bigger pandemic than the pandemic caused by the virus was the pandemic of conspiracy theories, the infodemic that swept the world and continues to sweep the world. Around 29% of Americans say they won't get vaccinated. Of that number, half say it's because the vaccine would be used to implant a microchip in their bloodstreams. That is a lot of people believing a very crazy thing. This was not a problem Dwight Eisenhower faced in 1957. It is a problem unique to our time. Now, it's been very easy, too easy, I think, to lay the blame for all that has gone wrong on a few unloved, at least unloved by the media, populist leaders. The simplest narrative that was constructed last year in the United States was that it was Trump's fault, in Britain was that it was Johnson's fault, in Brazil that it was Bolsonaro's fault, in India that it was Modi's fault, and I could keep going. In Doom, I try to show that this is a very deceptive and misleading analysis. Now, I'm not saying Donald Trump did not say and do some foolish things, some extraordinarily foolish things last year. He did. I'm just saying that they weren't the reason 500,000 Americans died. The reasons for the excess mortality had very little indeed to do with Trump. They had much more to do with a failure of the public health bureaucracy, including the Centers for Disease Control and the Department of Human Health and Human Services. It was convenient, indeed emotionally satisfying, for journalists to blame it on Trump. They had been hating him for years, and here was an opportunity to conclude the circle, to turn the Trump presidency into a morality play in which populism gets its just desserts in the form of a virus. But I think a moment's reflection will tell you why this argument must be wrong. Ask the counterfactual question. If Joe Biden had been president a year earlier, or if somehow magically Theresa May had remained in charge of British politics, would there have been no excess mortality in those countries? Did the pandemic stop the day after the inauguration of Joe Biden? The idea is, of course, absurd. What really caused excess mortality last year had very little to do with presidential or prime ministerial decisions. It actually had to do with little things that had huge consequences. To give one example, the utter failure of the American CDC to make tests widely available for COVID for months into the pandemic. A problem that had been solved in weeks in Taiwan and South Korea. Was it Trump sitting there sabotaging the testing kits? No. It had nothing to do with him that the CDC failed on this massive scale. Doom is not really about COVID. As you probably already guessed, it's really about all the other disasters that lie further back in time. And it's not just about pandemics, which are just one form of disaster. It's about all the disasters that characterize the pattern of human history, including even ones that kill relatively few people, but are spectacular. When the Space Shuttle Challenger blew up in 1986, just seconds after impact, some of you were watching on television, I would guess. It's a very memorable event for those of us who were old enough to see that. Only 7 people died, the crew. But why did it happen? Initially, the press in Washington ran with the narrative that Ronald Reagan had rushed the launch because he wanted to mention it in the State of the Union address. This was entirely fake news. The truth, as Richard Feynman, the great physicist, discovered, was that the NASA engineers had always known there was a 1 in 100 chance the space shuttle would blow up, and that the probability went up if the temperature at the launch was really low. They knew this. But Mr. Kingsbury, the bureaucrat in NASA, turned 1 in 100 in his report to Congress to 1 in 100,000. Understanding the difference between 1 in 100 and 1 in 100,000 is very important. It's actually roughly the difference between catching COVID if you're elderly, especially, and getting the vaccine. It wasn't Ronald Reagan. It was Mr. Kingsbury. But nobody could ever get a meeting with Mr. Kingsbury. In every organization, in every disaster, there is a Mr. Kingsbury. There was one in the United States last year. His name was Robert Kadlec, the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness. As they say in America, you had one job. Preparedness was his one job. In October, in 2018, just weeks after the publication of the 36-page Federal Pandemic Preparedness Plan, Robert Kadlec gave a lecture in which he said, if we don't build this, by which he meant an actually working insurance plan against the pandemic, we're going to be SOL, should we ever be confronted with it. We're whistling in the dark a little bit. SOL, I had never come across. But if you've worked with the American military, you know that it's shit out of luck, which is not a good thing. In other words, the man whose one job was pandemic preparedness admitted that if there actually were a pandemic, the pandemic preparedness plan would be no use and we would be SOL. Mr. Kingsbury. People who sign off on 36-page preparedness plans who know they won't work are really the issue. Like the people at CDC who failed entirely to make testing possible. Like the people in every state and most European countries who made no effective effort to protect the elderly in elderly care homes from the virus. That happened everywhere. It didn't matter if you were a populist prime minister or not. Idiots were letting infected people into elderly care homes almost everywhere. I want to conclude my remarks, I was told to keep it short, by just reflecting on the political consequences of disasters. Because some disasters have very big political consequences, and others do not. And this is a very difficult thing to figure out. Why did the 1957-58 pandemic have no consequences, and why is this one likely to have large consequences? The Black Death led to the Peasants' Revolt in England and much else. The First World War's biggest consequence was not the Asian flu, it was the Russian Revolution. A question that I often asked myself last year was whether 2020 could end up having comparable political consequences to those previous disasters, not perhaps on a 1917 scale, but still large. As in the 1340s, so in 2020, a plague unleashed a great wave not just of protest, but of expiation. The Black Lives Matter protests were the largest protests in American history. There were protests in 40% of all counties in the United States. Extraordinary scenes. Extraordinary, almost, and in some cases more than almost religious scenes. At times it felt like a revolutionary moment, and yet, in a disaster, there is a countervailing impulse to vote for normalcy. In 1920, the normalcy candidate was Warren Harding. In 2020, it was Joe Biden. Perhaps partly because of the protests, normalcy seemed attractive. But do you get normalcy? Or do you find yourself in a kind of cascade when one disaster leads to another? You lose control of the virus, you have no testing, you have no contact tracing, you have quarantining, so you do a lockdown. But then you've cratered the economy, so that you then have to double or treble or quadruple the deficit. And once you start doing that, it's hard to stop. $1 trillion here, $1 trillion there. Pretty soon you're talking big money. In the United States, as vaccination has been rolled out, the fiscal stimulus has kept on coming. The US economy has shown signs of overheating, or at least it did until the Delta wave struck. The next question, and those of you from the financial world, I know Zurich has a little bit of that, will understand that the big question now is inflation, yes or no? Transitory or not? That's the big question. Makes a huge difference to the investment strategies of everybody in this room, even the people who are still at the beginnings of their careers and have little money. It matters a lot if this is the late 1960s, which was the last time inflation expectations escaped from the control of central bankers. People forget the great inflation of the 1970s did not begin in 1973. It had already begun in the late 1960s. And the slope of the line looks a lot like the slope of the line as the Vietnam War escalated and the Fed lost control of inflation. Frankly, we welcome slightly higher inflation. Jay Powell said at the beginning of this year. Will those words come back to haunt him? This is a good question for historians to ask because pattern recognition helps us see that William McChesney Martin was a lot like Jay Powell, a kind of central banker for whom the independence of the central bank is in a sense relative. It also kind of depends on what the president thinks. Pattern recognition. Could the same be true in global politics? Does the cascade from the disaster in public health through economic policy have a geopolitical dimension? Are we rerunning in Kabul what happened in Saigon back in 1975? The question's often been asked. It's a good question. The resemblances are more than superficial. Ladies and gentlemen, one lesson from my book is that the next disaster is not likely to be the one we are expecting. We talk all the time about climate change. Our conferences are about climate change. There will be another in my native Glasgow in October. And yet we were talking about climate change at Davos in January of 2020. Greta Thunberg was the star of the show. Donald Trump was there to be booed. And hardly anybody seemed to notice that a pandemic had already begun. This is a grave danger if your disaster planning is all focused on one particular disaster that you find really interesting. It might not be the one you get. Or perhaps the climate debate is giving us a clue about what is really coming. After all, 48% of all the increase in carbon dioxide emissions since Paris are due to China. And it's on China that I want to offer my final thought. I think the real significance of the pandemic may in fact lie in the realm of geopolitics. Not in economics, not even in the domestic politics of the US, but in the way the pandemic has exacerbated what already had begun, namely Cold War II. I wrote about this already in 2018. Many people were skeptical. But since the pandemic, it's become more and more apparent to more and more people, and you can see in the opinion polling that this is true, that China is a problem. It is not accidental that the pandemic began in a one-party state that was capable of suppressing the realities for weeks on end and only admitted the scale of the problem when the virus was everywhere. This was Chernobyl, but on a vastly, vastly more damaging scale. In my view, the real disaster that lurks around the corner is the escalation of this Cold War into hot war, most likely hot war over Taiwan. And while we debate climate change earnestly, as we will, and as we should, I don't dismiss this as a threat, let's not forget that historically, only one thing comes close to pandemics when it comes to killing human beings prematurely on a very large scale, and that thing is war. I didn't intend to cheer you up tonight. What I tried to do was to put all of this in some kind of historical perspective and to offer the thought that what comes next may not be what you planned for. That the lesson of history is that disaster takes multiple forms, and that the distinction we draw between the natural and the man-made may in fact be an entirely artificial one. Was COVID-19 a natural disaster? Really? As we look ahead, it seems to me there's one thing that doom has to teach us. And that is that we need to apply history far more systematically to contemporary problems and encourage our leaders and the bureaucrats who serve them to do the same. If there's one thing I've learned over the last 18 months, it is that our inattention to history, our preference for models to the hard facts of the past, is one of the reasons that, oddly, we've got worse at managing disasters. Worse over the last 50 or 60 years, despite the exponential growth in our scientific knowledge. So history, ladies and gentlemen, history is the vaccine. And my book is your first dose. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Niall, for this fascinating lecture on history. I only can hope that we have enough books outside to get all vaccinated once or maybe even twice. So this is quite a lot of questions, I'm sure, in the audience and online. And I would say you really have to seize the opportunity, because Niall only comes all couple of times, 3-4 years you have to wait again. So please, yes.
There are roving microphones.
Yes.
And one is roving towards you.
My question is simple. Should China pay us reparations? I mean, also from a historical perspective, the Bank of International Settlement in Basel today issued a press release reminding us that in 1930 they were founded to administer the reparations from Germany after the First World War. I mean, the Bank of International Settlement is celebrating 1 year late the 90th anniversary. I'm interested in your question because that is a topic that goes around a lot. If China should pay us, if the world should force China to pay us. Thank you.
Well, this is a two-part question. Should is one part, and can we make them is another. And the second one is easy to answer, because it's very obvious that we cannot make them, any more than we can make them stop building coal-burning power stations. The great problem that is making Cold War II happen is we have absolutely no way of coercing China that is likely to be effective, no matter what it is that we would like them to do differently. We cannot even get the Chinese government to cooperate with an investigation into the origins of the pandemic, which was not really that big an ask. So I think the answer to the second part is easy. Should a country that is responsible for a pandemic, should it pay reparations? Is that a viable proposition? At a time when reparations in the United States are being called for to the descendants of slaves, at a time when reparations are being demanded from Great Britain for the alleged crimes of the British Empire, it's kind of reparations all around. And my sense is that we probably could learn an important lesson from the biggest of all the reparations cases, which was, of course, the reparations imposed on Germany after World War I. In 1918-19, it was possible to impose reparations on a defeated Germany on a very large scale, and when Germany defaulted, to invade a part of Germany to try to extract the money. Did it work out? Not well. My sense is that Germany had comparable responsibility for the outbreak of World War I to China's responsibility for COVID. It's not that anybody really planned this. I'm confident there was no genetically engineered virus unleashed. This seems more likely to have been an accident. Just in the same way that the German General Staff stumbled into World War I, mainly through miscalculating what Britain was going to do. So I don't think reparations, even in principle, is the way to go. I think it would be far better to point out not only that China made mistakes, which it did, but also that the World Health Organization went along with those mistakes, and that we can do something about. The World Health Organization has had a checkered career. It did tremendously well with SARS, the first great coronavirus epidemic. It failed miserably last year because it showed every sign of having become, if not captured by Beijing, then sufficiently deferential to it that it wasn't prepared to ask the hard questions. So I would, rather than ask for reparations, which we're not going to get, I would rather focus on what we can do to make the World Health Organization more effective than it was last year, because clearly other pandemics will come. And they won't all come from China. And they won't all be the result of cover-ups and negligence. We will be facing other pandemics. We can't expect to be paid by whichever country they start in. Would Mexico have paid reparations for swine flu if in 2008-9 swine flu had been really lethal? The question answers itself. So I prefer the idea that we learn practical things from this experience, and one of them must be that the World Health Organization is in need, an urgent need of reform. Thank you, sir.
That was a clear answer. Next question over there, the lady, and then the gentleman closer to me.
Thank you very much, Professor. Can you hear me all right despite my mask on?
I can hear you remarkably clearly through that mask.
Fabulous, thank you. The question I want to ask you is one that I'm very curious on because I've recently finished my DPhil on it. And you showed a slide on Afghanistan, sort of comparing it, the present situation to Saigon in 1975. And I was wondering, I've heard that comparison a lot as well, and I was wondering whether or not a more apt comparison might be Afghanistan itself in 1992.
Yes. No, it's a great question, and I didn't mean to imply that I like that comparison. Merely that it's clear that there is some superficial resemblance in the abandonment of Afghanistan and the abandonment of the Afghan government and the abandonment of South Vietnam. No, I'm not sure that your analogy is necessarily a huge deal better. You, of course, have just done a PhD on Afghanistan, so you're the expert in the room, and I would be very reckless to go head-to-head with an expert. I've just been reading Carter Malkasian's history, I presume you've seen it, of the war in Afghanistan, the first comprehensive and well-researched history of the American 20-year intervention. It's a brilliant book, actually, and it leaves you asking the question, was there some way of stabilizing the situation indefinitely at an acceptable cost? Term insurance, as one American general called it. And I must admit, I found myself thinking yes, because at least from my vantage point, once the troop levels had been brought down to where they were in around about 2015, 2014, although the war continued, it was not a war that the Taliban was bound to win. So I don't buy the idea that Joe Biden has presented that we had a choice between abandoning ignominiously and disgracefully Afghanistan or escalating. There seems to me to have been a middle position that would have been preferable to those two scenarios. But I welcome your thoughts. It's clearly not 75 in the sense that there was a much protracted interval between the peace agreement in 1973 and the debacle in 1975. The debacle happened because Congress cut off all aid to South Vietnam around the time of Watergate. South Vietnam, therefore, was in the position that the Afghan army was in for a more extended period with minimal American support. This has happened in a far, far shorter time frame, and I think has potentially far worse negative knock-on consequences. But I think you're right to question that analogy. Another one, of course, and this is the last point I'll make, is with 1979 Tehran. It's still not entirely clear to me that we don't have a hostage crisis. I think it rather depends on the Taliban if we do or not. I think if the Taliban don't get significant amounts of money, there will be a hostage crisis, but I think they're going to get that money. In fact, I think we're going to see the United States government of Joe Biden giving the Taliban quite a lot of money. And so it won't be Tehran 1979 for just that reason. But it is, I think, another interesting analogy. What really matters about Afghanistan, apart from the fate of the Afghan people, and particularly the Afghan women, what really matters is whether China and Russia infer from the American withdrawal that there is really no sheriff in town anymore. In which case, the big question is, as I said, Taiwan. In Cold War terms, Taiwan is simultaneously Berlin, Cuba, and the Persian Gulf, all at once. Because not only is it right next to China, not only is it obviously the flashpoint of the superpower confrontation, but it is the center of the global semiconductor industry, where the cutting-edge factories are located, where TSMC has its principal fabs. That's why it's the Persian Gulf as well as Cuba and Berlin. And of course, Afghanistan's economic significance by comparison is almost zero. So what really matters in the end is how far the other rival powers interpret this as a sign of weakness and therefore an invitation to make mischief and take risk.
Yes. Gentleman here, please.
Good evening, Professor Ferguson. I would like to nudge you just a little bit more on China. Some 13 years ago, I think it was, in The Ascent of Money, you coined the beautiful term of Chimerica. This, well, obviously you can explain it better than me, but it's a symbiotic relationship between the Chinese and the American economy, mutually beneficial. You did mention the possibility of a decoupling, but that was in 2008, and now, a good decade on, you're talking about Cold War II, World War III potentially. So my question to you, did we get it, or how come we got it so wrong, or maybe you got it wrong? Because, I mean, wasn't it obvious or evident that at some point, after century of humiliation in the long Chinese history, that China would come back at us, at the West, at some point, and would want to have a bit of revenge? Because at the time, you seemed very much in awe. You mentioned that you were walking along the Bund in Shanghai, and you were impressed by this economic rise of China. But now, a decade on, we're talking about Cold War II. So what happened?
Thank you for that question, phrased as I think you did it so cleverly. The first time the word Chimerica appeared in print was in the Wall Street Journal in early 2007, and it was a piece I co-authored with my good German friend at Bonn, Moritz Schularik. And if you go back and read the original piece, we say that the word Chimerica is a pun on the ancient Greek chimera. The idea is that Chimerica, this symbiotic relationship between the United States and China, is completely unsustainable and is like the chimera of ancient mythology, a kind of monster that couples together things that cannot really belong together. The real point of our writing that piece, and you should go back and have a look, is that we foresaw a crisis coming from these great flows of Chinese savings into the US current account, financing what was already obviously a housing bubble. So our argument was that this couldn't last, that it was this illusion, and we were right about that. It was actually one of the reasons for the financial crisis that ultimately interest rates had become completely disconnected from reality by Chinese reserve accumulation. So Moritz and I updated that paper in a number of iterations, and the thing that surprised us was that the decoupling didn't happen faster. We really thought that the financial crisis would blow Chimerica apart, but it didn't. There was a lot of rhetoric on each side, but it didn't really blow it up. And that was because, and this is interesting, China's massive domestic stimulus, really designed to insulate China from the financial crisis, had such huge spillover effects to the rest of the world, particularly through commodity prices, That China, in fact, was part of the reason that we didn't have a Great Depression after 2008. It wasn't intended to be that way, but China's domestic policies had massive spillover effects from which everybody benefited. Chimerica, therefore, did not die. What killed it was Xi Jinping's ascendancy. From the moment Xi became the supreme leader in China, Chinese policy changed direction in two distinct ways. Domestically, it became far more of an orthodox Marxist-Leninist dictatorship of the party. And internationally, China became far more assertive. I think, in a way, Cold War began around about the time that Xi had established his control in Beijing. But America didn't notice. Nobody noticed. Nobody noticed, or at least understood, the implications of the bases being constructed in the South China Sea, of the One Belt, One Road initiative, of the banning of Western ideas in Chinese education. We all kind of turned away because we were too busy enjoying Shanghai and telling ourselves, no, China is so different from the Soviet Union. And of all the people in the world, it took Donald Trump to waken Americans up to the Chinese threat. And it was extraordinary. The minute that Trump explicitly said China is a big part of our problem, a huge swathe of Middle America agreed with him, and then so did the American policy elite with amazing speed. It took a little while to get beyond the trade war to the Cold War, but by the end of 2018 we were there. Remember Mike Pence's speech of October 2018? So we got from Chimerica to Cold War. We got there a little bit more slowly than I foresaw, but we certainly got there between 2007 and 2018, just over 10 years. And that you can trace that arc in the writing that I did, but never accuse me of having been wrong. Don't do that. I don't like that. I'm allowed to say when I'm wrong, but you're not. Seriously, the piece originally foresaw that Chimerica was unsustainable, and in that sense, I don't think we were wrong.
Allow me to make a little bit of propaganda in this context, speaking about China and America. On the 14th of September next week, we have an NZZ podium on that topic. You are kindly invited to join. The moderator of this podium stands in this room. Next question, please, over there. Or do we have, one moment, do we have any online questions? Okay. Later.
Thank you, Professor, for taking my question. You showed this fascinating chart of monetary and fiscal largest, which in itself is quite fascinating to ponder. But the consequence thereof is, historically speaking, empires always went down when institution and its leader were to show too much profligacy. So in that sense, two questions. A, when will the US go down? Because it's the poster child in a historical context, how not to do it. And second, would it be a wise strategy to put shackles on those leaders in terms of reining in those profligacy? I know you're not a huge fan of one particular concept which you described in your book, Golden Feathers, but that could be one way. So I'm curious to see your assessment on that.
Thank you for that interesting question. One of the things that I point out in Doom is that it's really when empires fall that the catastrophe happens. The worst time for most empires is the time of their dissolution. The most violence in the history of British India was at the end, at the partition, to give just one example. And so those who dislike empire and yearn for empires to fall, forget that. They forget things fall apart. That the end of empire is a bad time in most cases. Now, when do empires end? Why do they end? This is one of the great questions of history that has preoccupied writers for many centuries. It continues to interest writers today, and I cite Ray Dalio's recent work in which he tries to identify the familiar cycle of empire that we're always looking for, because we always want there to be a cycle, don't we? The thing about a cycle is that it's so much nicer to predict. It has a certain logic to it. The empire is young and healthy, then it reaches its prime. That's where I am now in my life, as you probably know. And then, sadly, this has befallen some of you perhaps, you begin to feel a little less fit than you were, and then I'm afraid there's no stopping it. Decline and fall and end. This is the life cycle of the human individual. I'm sorry, it is. It will happen to us all.
It gets better and better, by the way.
There are a few exceptions. It all depends on your medication, really. But this is not how empires are. I mean, this is really not how history works. It is how human experience works, which is why we want to anthropomorphize everything. We want the empire to be young and then middle-aged and then old and then dead. It just fits in with how we expect things to work. But as I've tried to show, not only in this book but in others, in truth, there is no life cycle of empires. An empire is just a complex system, a great giant polity of bits and pieces joined from different cultures. And they don't necessarily have some arc which has a discernible beginning, middle, and end. They kind of rumble along and have bad patches, and then they reassemble, and bad patches, and they reassemble, and then bad patch, and it falls apart. And there's no real logic to that falling apart moment. There isn't some curve that tells you when it will happen, though Ray Dalio is the latest person to look for one. And that's, in some ways, the bad news. History is not that neat. If it were so predictable, I could tell you, oh, well, the United States is going to decline and fall. Let me just check. And about 7:20 on January the 13th, 2034. It's not like that. The United States looked, back in 1975, like it was declining and falling. And it looked like it was declining in the 1930s. Adolf Hitler thought it was all done and underestimated vastly its power for self-renewal. And that is the secret sauce that the United States has. The capacity to come out of a mess like Vietnam or a mess like COVID in Afghanistan and actually reassemble the different elements and bounce back. So I don't think the American empire is done. Even that excessive debt burden that we see today is at this point no higher than it was in 1946. I can think of all kinds of things that could go wrong. Wokeism could turn American universities into parodies of free and innovative institutions. It's true that the spending could just keep going and the debt could double. My sense is that that's not what will happen in the end, because the political pendulum is already swinging back to the center and then to the right. So I can't give you a neat answer to the question. Should there be shackles? You implied the gold standard as one possible constraint on the profligacy of politicians. The Germans tried the debt brake, which they're about to throw away. It's very, very difficult to make a modern large-scale economy function with a strict balanced budget rule or a monetary rule. Even if those rules seem to work, that the reality is that democracy will find a way around. And probably it should find a way around. I mean, if we run the counterfactual of the financial crisis with austerity, it is a much worse outcome. You can't really persuade me that we could have run balanced budgets in 2009, 10, 11, anywhere, and not had a more intense and maybe lasting depression. So my sense is the empire's not done. The United States will surprise. It's China that is more likely to decline and fall. And that is one of the most important takeaways of this book. China looked like it won 2020. It seemed to repress the virus. It seemed to get its economy back together. The US looked like it was a mess. But in Doom, I show that those apparent victories were superficial. More profound problems were building for China. China had alienated people around the world, as the last slide I showed you illustrated. China had, after all, been responsible for the origins of the pandemic. China's economy, far from bouncing back, looks likely to grow at maybe 6% this year, far below the 9% the institutions were predicting last year. And China's population is on the brink of a steep steep decline. The workforce is already shrinking. The numbers are so bad they won't publish the true census data. So the really interesting story here is just as in the 1970s. It seemed like the US was done. The Soviet Union felt overconfident. It invaded Afghanistan. It did a whole bunch of other crazy stuff in Africa and Central America. And along comes Ronald Reagan, and 1989 is there. Before you know it, Soviet Union is gone in 1991. And that happened so fast that almost all commentators were taken by surprise. My guess is something very similar might play out in this coming decade. China's much, much more troubled than we see from outside. And meanwhile, the United States, with or without shackles, fiscal or monetary, will figure out and reinvent itself and bounce back in ways that at this point we can scarcely imagine.
And not to forget the enormous brain power China has and deploys. This is also an amazing factor, no? I mean, this is...
Chinese brain power is of course crucial, but if you read a very interesting report published last year by Macro Polo, the flow of top artificial intelligence talent is still overwhelmingly from China to the United States. It is absolutely clear that the one superpower the United States still has is the ability to attract talent from abroad. As long as the United States imports talent and China does not, my money is on the United States. Because that is the key. I mean, I speak, of course, as an immigrant to the United States. I am not claiming any special prowess on my part. I'm just saying that that's the thing that China cannot do. Nobody is lining up to become a citizen of the People's Republic of China. Let me tell you that. Nobody. And yet, when I became an American citizen, in a hall vastly larger than this, full of new Americans, the single largest group taking the oath to the Constitution were Chinese. This was in Oakland, California.
Yeah, we're all watching America.
Well, they're not all, and one shouldn't imply that they are all agents of the PRC. On the contrary, some of the most ardent critics of the Chinese Communist Party that I have met are people born in China who have come to the United States. Let me tell you one brief anecdote. I know that time is short. An eminent professor born in China who has worked for many years at a major university and is also involved in the big Silicon Valley companies, said to me after her bona fides had been questioned by an American senator, how dare they question my loyalty to the United States? She was a citizen. And do they not understand why I am here? Because the communists killed my effing grandfather. I said to Vice President Pence once, at all costs, we must focus our criticism on the Chinese Communist Party, because the Chinese people, inside and outside China, including the many, many ethnically Chinese in the United States, have every reason to side with the free world against the CCP if push comes to shove. And it's a terribly important point.
I mean, also talk to the survivors of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, not only in America, but also in Europe, etc., etc. So we have one online question, please.
I'll make that too, okay?
Great.
You choose. What should be the strategy of the West to avoid that the Cold War with China could turn into a hot one? And what can we learn from this crisis with regards to other non-health related crises in the future?
Two great questions. Thank you to online questioners for those. The most important way to avoid hot war is credible deterrence. Why did the Korean War happen? Why did Stalin encourage the North Koreans to invade South Korea and initiate the first really large war of the Cold War era? The answer is that the US government, the Truman administration, had omitted South Korea from its list of defensible territories in an important policy document shortly before. There was no credible deterrence in South Korea. The United States had to scramble a response from virtually nowhere as it had almost no military presence to begin with. So I think in Taiwan, the story is clear. Right now, the United States does not have credible deterrence. Of the last 20 war games, which imagined a war in the Taiwan Strait that the US Pentagon has run, China has won them all. So we have to change that. We have very, very quickly to raise the cost of an invasion of Taiwan to the point that it will be too risky for Xi Jinping to undertake. The second question you asked, or that was asked online, is what can we learn from COVID, from our poor handling in the Western world generally of this pandemic, about other possible challenges that we may face? And that is one of the most important reasons I wrote Doom. A lot of people have said to me, why didn't you wait until the pandemic was over? And I'm like, well, how long would that be? I mean, I'm 57. Are we going to wait till it's endemic? Tell me how long that will be. When will COVID go from being pandemic to endemic? 10 years? 20 years? Influenza, it was about 50 years. Okay, so I'm not available 50 years from now. I'm very sorry. Not unless I find out what you're taking, right? So I wrote the book in a hurry before it was over because we have to stop doing this. We have to stop having preparedness plans that don't work when the thing actually happens. We had a financial crisis preparedness plan in 2007. It was called Basel II, remember? There was this extraordinarily complex set of rules about bank capital adequacy that turned out to be as useless as the pandemic preparedness plan when there was an actual financial crisis. And I could go on. Again and again, bureaucracies on both sides of the Atlantic produce long and complex plans for dealing with this or that contingency. And what these plans have in common is that they do not work when the actual thing happens. Now, I think learning from this problem, we can see where the points of failure are. No, it's not just the president. Let's not blame the president every time anything goes wrong. Let's recognize that we have some bureaucratic malfunctions that look systemic. It looks as if government agencies are less good than they were in the 1950s at dealing rapidly with crises. They're slow to respond. We can address these problems, for example, by learning from the Taiwanese. Why were they quick? I'll tell you one reason, and it's very appropriate in answering an online question. More than any government I know, they have used technology to make government accountable to citizens. Audrey Tang, the digital minister, has said for years, we can use software platforms and open source code to make government more responsive to citizens. And it's extraordinarily impressive when you go there and see what this means. It was why they never had to lie about masks. Some of us are wearing masks, and I can't because of the microphone. When the mask issue first came up, nobody had enough. In the United States, they lied. At the beginning, they told everybody, you don't need a mask. And then they said, once there were enough masks, sorry, did I say you didn't need a mask? I don't know what I was thinking. Actually, you really need a mask. The Taiwanese did not do that. They said, we don't have enough masks. It's pretty clear who should get them, and they used a very effective software tool for allocating masks to frontline health workers. They did not lie. I think we can learn a huge amount from the way in which the Taiwanese have used technology in the last year. Now, they failed in one important respect. They were so successful at repressing the spread of the virus that they failed to vaccinate their population. Nobody comes out of this story with a gold medal. There are maybe no gold medals in pandemics. But when you look at their initial response, what you see is the speed of the response, the candor, the honesty with the public, the way that technology was used. They had a contact tracing system that put all the Western attempts at this to shame. And I've come away from writing this book optimistic. Now, you may say, your book called Doom is an optimistic book. Well, I could have called it fun, but I think that would have been a little misleading. The conclusion I've come to is that our problems are very fixable. That the reason bureaucracies malfunction are not enormously complex to fathom. that we can make both public and private agencies less cumbersome and bureaucratic, more honest. We can make the plans more workable. And you know what really counts with a plan? Test it. Actually have some trials, some test runs. None of those things conventionally happen other than in the military where plans are really tested. So my conclusion is we can actually fix many of the problems that bedeviled our pandemic response, and we need to. Because let me tell you this, somewhere in the Pentagon, there is a 36-page cyber war preparedness plan. And when that cyber attack happens, which will be the first act of the US-China war if there is one, when the massive cyber attack happens and it all stops working, the email, the cell phones, the Zoom calls, that cyber war preparedness plan could be as useless as the pandemic preparedness plan was. And then we will be in real trouble. And then it won't be the gentle decline of the American empire. It will be the sudden and disastrous fall. And that is what we should be, certainly as an American, should be most worried about.
I think that's a very optimistic ending.
It's as optimistic as I get.
I always call you Mr. Optimist, but sometimes you have the title Mr. Doom. So you mixed it very well tonight, and the next conference will be held here anyway on the topic Bureaucracies and the Fate of Mankind. You're already invited, and you have my full support. So now, there's always the tradition to give the speaker a gift, whatever he does then afterwards with it. But before I will proceed to that, we have a quick outlook on what is expecting you, ladies and gentlemen, and I hope to see all of you again. So it fits perfectly on 20th of October, the Secretary of the Interior, Mr. Alain Berset, is coming, and he of course also will speak about the pandemic, and you really can ask him what you ever wanted to but didn't dare till now. Here we have the opportunity. Then we have the famous American historian, colleague of Neil Ann Applebaum. She's absolutely fascinating, a powerhouse. Another powerhouse is Elif Shafak, the Turkish writer. And finally we have the explorer Bertrand Piccard, who with his balloon made amazing things, 40,000 miles or close to the moon, and so this is also very, very interesting. Is there another slide I have to comment? Okay, the next one. Yes, here we have our special format created during the COVID crisis. CIAF didn't sleep. We were not locked down, at least not mentally, and we have now this wonderful live stream from a studio, first with another Bundesrätin. It's really an inflation of politicians this fall, head of the defense minister, Neil. This is very important, with Katja Centinetta, and again with her, Paul Bulke, chairman of Nestle, and then 2 evenings at the Literaturhaus with the fantastic German historian Aleida Assmann, and as the same thing is to be said about Dan Diener and his book. So this is it? Yeah, that's him, you know him. Okay. So now the gift. It's always risky, and I have to say, what we learned in Swiss military service was this. When we were all prepared to everything, we could fight all enemies at the same time, and so, thank God it never happened. And if there was radioactivity around, the colonel said, no, it was the corporal said, well, then immediately take a piece of metal and cling on another piece of metal, and that means it's very dangerous, it's all full of radioactivity. There were other signals acoustically, but there is another one. Also in opera, and it's a horn. The horn can blow like in the Wagnerian operas, and this is very scary, something happens and we don't know what. But there is another horn which is entirely peaceful, and if the cows hear it, they produce better milk. It's the Alp horn. So we have here a little Alp horn for you. It's a small, because for beginners we start with small Alphorns, and if you succeed, you get also lessons from our part to develop more skills, and then you get a real big one, and you can see yourself already pretty happy with this big one, but small is also beautiful, and small is Switzerland, so this is for you and your fantastic wife. I have to mention her too.
Thank you so much, Martin. Thank you very much indeed. Can one put tobacco in them?